Everyone loves Cleto. He's everyone here at the show. We are devastated by this. It's just not fair.
Everything I have is because of Rob.
Never met Rob before. First reading, Norman introduces me to the cast. He says, he's going to be our guest star this week. And we hit it off. We played best friends, and we became best friends.
A will can feel like paperwork, cold, legal, final. But this one landed like a verdict. One sentence stood out above all others. Sharp, distant, unforgiving. My son Nicholas will receive nothing from my estate. No explanation, no softening language. Not a dollar. Not a message of reconciliation. Not even a goodbye. The words were read aloud by Billy Crystal, a lifelong friend. Someone who knew Rob Reiner well enough to hear the tremble in his own voice as he spoke. Those in the room later said Billy paused more than once, struggling to continue, as if the meaning of the sentence was still sinking in even as he read it. And that shock was only the beginning. At nearly the same time the will was revealed, Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were gone from their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. The house stood silent behind its gates. No activity, no answers. Just stillness, and a growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong. What truly happened behind those gates would not first come from press briefings or breaking news alerts. It came from this document, a final will that didn't just divide property, but exposed years of buried tension inside a family once seen as solid, loving, and unbreakable.
What a tremendous loss, and he leaves behind such a legacy. Thank you for all the great work on and off screen and continuing to be an inspiration to me and millions of people around the world. In the end, I'm going to remember all of the laughs that you get.
This was not a typical Hollywood tragedy. It was about secrets, about fracture, about a final decision that changed everything. According to court findings, the will had been notarized, witnessed, and officially filed just 72 hours before Rob's passing. It was deliberate, measured, legally airtight, not the act of confusion or panic, and the timing raised immediate questions. 3 days earlier, Rob and Michelle,
everywhere.
Rob changed the course of my life. And if he hadn't, I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you now.
had quietly met with their attorney. No family present, no discussion. Rob was reportedly calm, firm, and resolved. He made a single request, repeated twice to ensure clarity. My son Nicholas will receive nothing from my inheritance for reasons he knows. Only one person was told ahead of time, Billy Crystal. Records later confirmed that Rob had called Billy late that same night. His voice sounded worn down, emotionally exhausted. He admitted something he had never said out loud before. "I don't know what to do with Nick anymore," he said. "I think he hates me." Billy tried to reassure him, reminding him of love, patience, history. But Rob's response was quiet and heavy. "I'm rewriting everything," he said.
And if it wasn't for Rob, I don't think I would have ever been able to make that dream come true in such a dramatic and incredible way.
And if anything happens to me, promise you'll read it. That call would later be described as a turning point. A father not acting out of anger, but fear. Nicholas had struggled for years. Public records and family sources later described a long pattern involving addiction recovery, emotional volatility, and repeated conflicts. Still, Rob continued to support him. He funded projects. He stayed involved. He allowed Nick to live on the property in the guest house, believing closeness was safer than distance. Some called it compassion. Others quietly worried it was too much tolerance. That line became dangerously thin. On the morning everything unraveled, the Brentwood estate looked peaceful, birds in the jacaranda trees, sprinklers running across the lawn. A quiet Sunday behind tall hedges and locked gates. Rob and Michelle were planning a simple family brunch, bagels, smoked salmon, fruit. Jake and Roy were invited. Nick remained in the guest house. Nothing appeared out of place. But the timeline tells a different story. Shortly after 7 in the morning, Rob was seen making coffee in his robe. Michelle joined him minutes later. A brief phone call followed, less than a minute long. Witnesses later said Rob's demeanor shifted immediately afterward. He went quiet, tense, staring at the floor. No one knows who was on the other end of that call. By mid-morning, the housekeeper arrived through the back gate. She noticed the guest house lights were still on, unusually early. A loud noise followed, like something falling, but she dismissed it. Text messages from Roy went unanswered. Calls went straight to silence. Then came voices. Raised, urgent, desperate. Shortly afterward, a security camera inside the home stopped recording for exactly 17 minutes. When it resumed, no one had entered or exited. Experts later stated the interruption appeared deliberate. By the time Roy arrived just after 9, the house was quiet, in a way that felt wrong. No alarms, no signs of forced entry, just stillness. What she discovered moments later would change her life forever. In the emergency call that followed, her voice broke as she tried to explain. She said something had happened to her parents. She said she had warned them. And when asked if anyone else was inside the home, her answer came through sobs. "No, he's not here." Nicholas was gone. Inside the guest house, investigators later found signs of hurried movement, missing clothing, an open bag, disabled cameras, and a notebook with torn pages and a single line written in red ink that raised immediate concern. "I created him. He owes me everything." Even more unsettling, officers discovered a copy of the previous will inside a locked fireproof box, the version where Nicholas was still included. How he obtained it and when he learned he was disinherited became a critical focus of the investigation. Less than 8 hours later, authorities located Nicholas miles away at a gas station. Surveillance showed him calm, composed, blending into an ordinary moment. He purchased a drink, paid, and stepped outside. When officers approached, he did not resist. He said only one thing: "They pushed me. I didn't do anything." Those words would echo long after. And somewhere else, sealed and never sent, investigators later uncovered a letter Rob had written to his son 3 days earlier. The first line stopped everyone who read it. "My Nick, I once loved you." The rest of that letter has never been released. And that is where this story truly begins. Roy's phone slipped from her hand as she moved slowly down the hallway. She didn't run. She didn't scream. Something inside her already knew. She followed the marks on the floor toward the master bedroom, whispering the same words over and over. "No, no, no." When she reached the doorway, her body froze before her mind could catch up. She stood there, unable to step forward, unable to step back. Rob was on the floor. Michelle was nearby. The room felt heavy, silent, overwhelming. The emergency call that followed lasted just over 6 minutes, but every second stretched endlessly. Roy's voice shook as she tried to explain what she was seeing. She struggled to breathe. When the dispatcher asked who might be responsible, her answer came without hesitation. "It's my brother, Nick. I know it's him." That certainty stunned investigators. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't panicking blindly. Her confidence came from things she had noticed for months, even years, but never fully understood until that moment. Roy didn't live in the Brentwood house, but she visited often. Over time, the atmosphere had changed. Small details stood out. Michelle would tense when Nick entered a room. Rob watched him closely during meals. Doors that were never locked before suddenly were. Conversation stopped when Nick appeared. The house no longer felt relaxed. It felt guarded. 3 nights before everything happened, Roy stopped by briefly to drop off script pages for her father. She didn't plan to stay. As she walked past the guest house, she heard shouting. Not loud chaos, controlled, intense, focused. Then Rob's voice cut through, firm and final. "You're out, Nick. That's it. No more chances." At the time, she didn't fully process it. Later, every word replayed in her mind. She also told police about something else that had unsettled her deeply. 2 weeks earlier, she and Michelle had cleaned a cupboard and found a sealed envelope marked in Rob's handwriting. "Open only if I'm gone." When Roy asked about it, Michelle didn't smile. She simply said Rob was afraid of what Nick might do. After that day, the envelope vanished. Remembering the fear, the arguments, and the missing envelope, Roy didn't hesitate when officers asked who she believed was responsible. She said the name she had quietly feared for a long time. Nick. She also shared something she hadn't mentioned before. Days earlier, while looking for a cable, she noticed an open notebook on a table in the guest house. She wasn't searching for anything personal, but certain lines caught her eye. "He took everything. He made me this." She didn't confront Nick. She didn't tell her parents, but those words came rushing back as she stood outside the house, shaking, surrounded by police. As officers secured the property, they realized there was no frantic chase needed. Nick had already left, but he hadn't covered his tracks well. The guest house told its own story. From the outside, it looked pristine. Modern design, clean lines, a peaceful pool view. But inside, it felt empty and tense. Curtains drawn, lights dim, dishes left untouched. The air felt stale, heavy, disconnected. When officers entered later that morning, Nick was gone. What they found instead raised serious concern. Furniture damaged, a mirror shattered, walls marked with repeated phrases, pages torn from notebooks and scattered across the floor. One sentence appeared again and again. "He promised me everything. He left me nothing." Under the bed, investigators discovered a printed copy of Rob Reiner's older will, the version from years earlier. Nick's name had been marked through with a red symbol. Nearby were emails discussing trust arrangements. One line stood out, suggesting everything depended on Nick's behavior during the coming months. To investigators, it appeared he knew he was on final notice. Rewinding further, Nick had once been viewed as someone with real potential. Rob's son, access, opportunity. But behind that image were years of instability, treatment programs, and emotional volatility. Rob continued trying to help, even collaborating on a deeply personal project years earlier, hoping structure would bring stability. Instead, sources say that final hope collapsed. Nick believed his father could fix anything. When Rob finally set limits, that belief turned into resentment. Inside a locked box in the guest house, officers found another disturbing detail. Not illegal, but unsettling. Items that suggested fixation, obsession, a sense of being wronged. Investigators also uncovered something far more serious, a small listening device hidden beneath the dining table. It had been quietly connected for weeks. Nick had been listening to conversations, arguments, fears, warnings. Rob's private words replayed again and again, Michelle expressing concern, Roy warning that Nick was becoming unpredictable. Rob's voice appeared in multiple recordings. Apologies. Worry, and one sentence that stood out above all others. "You scare me." That line shifted everything. Rob hadn't just cut Nick out financially. He had begun pulling away emotionally. Nick interpreted that as betrayal, living steps away yet excluded, watching gatherings from a distance, hearing fear instead of trust. The guest house became what Nick himself described in his notes as a cage with a view. One line investigators highlighted read, "You can be surrounded by people and still be completely alone." Then came the will. "My son Nicholas will receive nothing from my estate for reasons he knows." Investigators believe Nick learned about the will before it was officially revealed. How remains under review, but digital records suggest he accessed material not meant for him. Police later found a hidden folder labeled simply Truth. Inside were audio files, including one short recording that immediately drew attention. Rob, speaking to someone believed to be his close friend Billy Crystal, said quietly, "I'm afraid he'll hurt her if anything happens to me." The recording ended abruptly. After that, Nick left. He gathered cash, packed essentials, and was later seen on surveillance footage far from Brentwood. Calm, quiet, ordinary, buying a drink, blending into a normal moment. But the silence didn't last. Another voice entered the story. Tracy Reiner. Rob's adopted daughter had lived away from the spotlight for years. She hadn't attended the will reading. She wasn't in California when everything happened. But 3 days after the discovery, she walked into a police station on her own. No cameras, no statement, just a sealed envelope. She said only 2 things. "He wrote this for me." And I think he knew he wouldn't be able to send it. The email she carried had arrived days before everything fell apart. The subject line read simply, "If anything happens." Inside, Rob wrote openly about years of fear, about arguments, about threats that had never been made public. He admitted he had considered taking formal steps, but always stopped himself because he was a father. He wrote one final sentence that would later become central to the case. "If anything happens to us, it will not be an accident." That message, combined with the recordings, changed the direction of the investigation entirely. This was no longer about missing footage or speculation. It was about warning signs that had been written down, and the most painful question still remained. Why didn't Rob act sooner? The answer, investigators believe, was heartbreakingly simple. Despite everything, he still hoped his son would change. Rob still loved Nick right up until the end, and that's what makes every detail feel so heavy. The letter and the recording were never meant for public consumption. They weren't written to win sympathy or shape headlines. They were written like a lifeline. One last attempt to make sure the truth didn't vanish if something went wrong. And once those materials surfaced, they changed the entire tone of the case. Because when a father leaves behind a message that reads like a warning, it becomes impossible to treat what happened as a random tragedy. It becomes a timeline, a pattern, a long, quiet build that nobody wanted to name out loud. The next person forced to face that truth was Billy Crystal. When the question came up, who would read Rob Reiner's final will, Billy stood without hesitation. No media performance, no dramatic pause for cameras. Just a man stepping forward because he had promised his friend he would. And the moment he opened the envelope, everything in the room shifted. His hands shook as he began to read. The lawyers went still. Jake and Roy didn't move. The air felt tight, like no one wanted to breathe too loudly. Every line hit harder than the last, not because it was a list of assets, but because it carried a message that sounded like emotional finality. And then Billy reached the line everyone had been dreading. My son, Nicholas, will receive nothing from my estate, for reasons he knows. His voice cracked. He tried to stay steady, but you could hear disbelief inside the words, like he still couldn't accept that Rob had felt forced to write something that direct, that cold, that final. The room didn't react like Hollywood. It reacted like family. Because beneath all the fame, beneath the history, beneath the legacy, this wasn't a glamorous moment. It was a painful confirmation. Something had been wrong for a long time, and Rob had reached a point where he believed he had to put that fear into writing. But here's what people misunderstand. This story didn't begin with a fatal incident. It began long before that, years earlier, with warning signs that kept getting explained away. Not one massive explosion, but many smaller ones that the family tried to survive. Doors slammed, arguments that started as normal tension but kept returning with more weight. Accidents that didn't feel like accidents. Moments that didn't fit the everything's fine story. And the longer time passed, the more the family learned to live around the tension instead of confronting it head-on. People close to the family allegedly say that as far back as 2009, the shift was already visible. Nick had been in and out of treatment. Rob and Michelle tried different approaches. Distance, support, structure, privacy, hope. The kind of hope parents hold even when they're exhausted. But according to accounts that later circulated, Nick's energy changed over time, less impulsive, more controlled. Sometimes quiet, sometimes watching. Not always loud, but intense in a way that made people uncomfortable. And then came moments that stuck in the family's memory because they didn't feel like ordinary conflict. One night at a family dinner, they were talking about Jake's college film. It was supposed to be calm, normal conversation, normal family energy. Rob, trying to be encouraging, suggested Nick might help Jake with some guidance. And that's when everything allegedly snapped. Nick pushed back hard, emotionally sharp, loudly defensive. The room froze. Michelle tried to bring the tone down, tried to redirect, tried to calm things. But the tension didn't melt. It grew. And from that point on, the family's daily life reportedly started changing in small, protective ways. Certain doors stayed locked. Certain boundaries appeared. Conversations became careful. People started avoiding topics just to keep the peace. Over time, Jake kept his distance more often. Roy sought therapy support on her own. Michelle reportedly seemed more guarded. And still, despite all of it, Rob kept trying. Because that's the part outsiders don't always understand. Sometimes the love doesn't disappear, even when the fear starts taking up space. Then came 2015, the period that looked like healing from the outside. Nick, working with his father on a project, appeared to be a bridge, something constructive, something grounding, something that made people think the family was finally moving forward. But according to later claims from people around the production, it wasn't peaceful behind the scenes. The dynamic was complicated, emotional, tense. Nick reportedly felt like the story was being taken out of his hands. Rob, as a filmmaker, did what filmmakers do: revised, reshaped, edited. But for Nick, the revisions allegedly felt personal, like proof that he didn't control his own narrative. And when the project failed to become what Nick hoped it would become, something reportedly shifted again. By 2018, sources claim Rob reduced financial support, hoping boundaries would force stability. But the reaction, according to those accounts, wasn't acceptance. It was anger. There were incidents at family events where Nick allegedly arrived unexpectedly, creating scenes that made everyone feel exposed and unsafe. And still, again, the family reportedly tried to keep things private. Not because they didn't see the danger, because they didn't want to turn their child into a public headline. That pattern, protecting the family image, protecting Nick from consequences, protecting hope, continued longer than it should have. Then a disturbing moment allegedly surfaced during the 2021 period, in which an argument about inheritance and abandonment became more direct than anyone was comfortable with. Words were reportedly said that sounded less like emotion and more like a threat. And that's the moment the family's private fear started becoming sharper. Michelle reportedly considered moving. Jake talked about security upgrades. Roy said she had a feeling she couldn't shake. But nobody made the call that would have changed everything because family kept overriding risk. And then, according to this narrative, the fatal incident happened. After the arrest, people who had watched the tension build for years said the same thing in private. It wasn't shocking. It felt like something that had been circling the family for a long time. The question became less about if the conflict would explode and more about how far it would go. That's why one specific detail carried so much weight afterward: the alleged recording between Rob and Billy Crystal. Days before the will reading, according to accounts tied to Billy, Rob confided something that sounded like a parent reaching a breaking point. Not anger, not revenge, fear. Billy reportedly tried to calm him, to offer solutions, to tell him to take action. But Rob didn't ask for a strategy in that moment. He asked for a promise. If anything happens, read it. And that promise is what put Billy in that room, holding an envelope that didn't feel like paperwork. It felt like a final message. When Billy read the line about Nick receiving nothing, Roy gasped. Jake's fists tightened. Tracy didn't react the way others did, because reportedly, she already knew what Rob had been afraid to say out loud. And Billy, after pausing after trying to steady himself, said something quietly that mattered. Rob wanted peace. He didn't want harm. But truth mattered more. Because the will wasn't just legal language. It sounded like a warning that Rob believed could not be softened anymore. Later, Billy reportedly described that moment as one of the hardest of his life. Harder than public ceremonies, harder than professional milestones. Because it wasn't performance. It wasn't Hollywood. It was grief mixed with regret. And that regret grew louder when weeks later Billy spoke publicly in an interview setting. He described the late-night calls, the fear in Rob's voice, the guilt he carried. Rob loved Nick, he said, and he feared him too. When asked if Rob believed this could happen, Billy didn't hesitate. He said Rob had been afraid for a long time, and then he admitted something that hit people hard because it sounded painfully human. I regret not going to his house. I regret not hugging him one more time. I regret not saying, let's leave, let's reset, let's fix this together. That message spread because it wasn't gossip. It wasn't drama. It was someone realizing too late that fear had become normal inside a family that kept trying to love its way through danger. And then one last detail surfaced, something few people knew. Rob allegedly left a sealed message recorded shortly before everything happened. Not about money, not about Nick in a public sense, about his children, about worry, about the future. And what made it so chilling was how short it was, because Rob didn't explain the reasons in detail. He didn't need to. In his mind, Nick already knew. That one sentence, for reasons he knows, wasn't meant for lawyers. It was meant for Nick. A direct, final line Rob believed couldn't be twisted, edited, or rewritten. Legal analysts later suggested that the structure of the will made it difficult to challenge. And if that's true, it only strengthens the idea that Rob wasn't writing like a man planning retirement. He was writing like a man trying to protect the truth. And for Roy, that truth became personal in a way the public could never fully understand. Because she wasn't just processing a will. She was processing years of quiet fear, years of moments that didn't make sense until it was too late. Years of, maybe it'll get better, that ended with irreversible loss. And that's why the story doesn't land like entertainment. It lands like a warning. That families can normalize tension, normalize instability, normalize fear, until the line between love and denial becomes impossible to see. Rob Reiner didn't just leave behind a will. In this telling, he left behind a final boundary, a final truth, a final message that said, I tried, I loved, I hoped, but I can't pretend anymore. And in the middle of it all, Roy chose to face what others avoided. Because sometimes the only way forward is to stop looking away. If this story moved you, like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel.